Hello. Today's video is the sermon for the Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul Apostles, and we'll be looking at all three of the readings. So the passages that were for Sunday are in the description below. Today is the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul Apostles, one of a handful of holy days in the church year that take precedence over the regular Sunday observance. Today we celebrate the life and ministry of these two apostles who were foundational for the early church. The Apostle Paul has left to us a number of letters, either written by him or attributed to him, including the letter which today's epistle lection is from, his second letter to Timothy. Stories of Paul's ministry may also be found in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter, meanwhile, is prominent in all four Gospels, as well as in the early chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, and also has two letters in the New Testament which he either wrote or which were written later and attributed to him. Tradition has it that both Peter and Paul were martyred in or near Rome around the time of the Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians following the Great Fire that devastated Rome. Peter's death is referred to in today's story from John's Gospel, said to have been predicted by Jesus. Peter tends to be the more relatable of the two apostles, because the Gospels present him as a devoted but impetuous follower of Jesus. In all four Gospels, Peter denies Jesus 3 times during Jesus' hearing before the high priest. Only in John's Gospel, in today's story, does it recount Peter's restoration by Jesus. But all four Gospels show in one way or another that Peter's denial of Jesus is forgiven. Paul, by contrast, can sometimes come across as bossy, and his letters can be hard to understand at times. Still, Paul's miraculous transformation from persecutor to apostle is inspiring to many. Our passages from Scripture today are meant to tell us something of the impact of Peter and Paul on the life of the church. In today's passage from the prophet Ezekiel, it is admittedly God, and no human agent, who restores the lost sheep of Israel and from exile, and cares for them as their shepherd. Nevertheless, that it is today's Old Testament reading suggests that it is through the ministry of the apostles, particularly of Peter and Paul, that God does these things. Paul's second letter to Timothy may have been written by Paul toward the end of his life during his imprisonment in Rome. In today's passage from that letter, Paul exhorts Timothy, to whom the letter is addressed, to be faithful, perseverant, resilient, and ardent in preaching the gospel. In today's story from John's Gospel, Jesus asks Peter 3 times if Peter loves him. A threefold restoration of Peter, undoing Peter's threefold denial of Jesus. Each time Peter tells Jesus he does love him, Jesus charges responsibility for the rest of Jesus' flock. Feed my lambs, he says, and again, tend my sheep, and feed my sheep. Jesus shows his trust in Peter in this way. Peter will prove to be a good shepherd, as Jesus was, particularly as he is presented in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul, for his part, expresses confidence that he has served Christ faithfully, saying, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Peter is presented at the beginning of his apostolic ministry, and Paul at the end of his. Through them both, God, in the words of the prophet Ezekiel, seeks the lost, brings back the strayed, binds up the injured, and strengthens the weak. It is a fitting testament to their influence. God's grace is manifested in the stories of Peter and Paul in that both went from being, in effect, enemies of the cross of Christ to pillars of the church, because of an encounter each had with the risen Christ. We saw how in today's gospel, Jesus forgives Peter by asking Peter 3 times if Peter loves him, reversing Peter's betrayal. The Apostle Paul does not recount his transformational encounter with Jesus in his own words in his letters, but in the story according to the Acts of the Apostles, Jesus commissions Paul to serve him in spite of his persecutory zeal. Now, when it comes to how God's grace will interact with those who express hostility toward Christians, the scriptures are somewhat contradictory. For Jesus says both, whoever is not against us is for us, but also, whoever is not with me is against me. Now, as always, context is important. Jesus says the first, whoever is not against us is for us, in response to a complaint by one of his disciples that an unaffiliated exorcist was casting out demons in Jesus' name. And he says the second, whoever is not with me is against me, in response to the accusation that Jesus casts out demons by the power of Satan. I would say that what we are to take away from this is that while we should be prepared to defend ourselves against hostility, we must always be willing to show God's love to our enemies, for we never know if God will work through us to open their hearts to Christ. God's grace is, after all, both powerful and unpredictable. It is always a surprise to discover that some seemingly insignificant act of love that we have done for someone else that meant little or nothing to us has made a huge difference in the life of that person. Indeed, simply acknowledging another person can make their day. God can work great transformations in the smallest of encounters. Speaking for myself, I tend to underestimate how much of an impact I have on the lives of others out of, I'm sure, misplaced humility. And I suspect that a lot of Anglicans are the same way. Now, although Jesus acts directly in the stories of the transformations of Peter and Paul, God prefers to transform others through the acts of love of ordinary people, people like you and me. So let us dare to perform acts of love, however simple, for others and for each other, for even the smallest of deeds can have a surprisingly big effect. We really can make a difference. We really can be channels of God's grace and love.